So, chapter 2 in Jaspers' book, The Origin and Goal of History, is called The Schema of World History. It's a very short, brief chapter in which Jaspers gives his model, a meta-narrative of world history, which he sees as a sequence of 4 distinct phases. And he starts off this chapter by saying that the first point to note, before getting to that, is that the origin of civilization has taken place geographically along a very narrow band from the shores of Europe and West Africa, going across the Mediterranean, Asia Minor, into India and China, and eventually, of course, across the water again to the New World. But the past 6,000, 7,000, 8,000, let's say 10,000 years of human history, I suppose, since the melting of the glaciers at the end of the last ice age, 14,000 years ago, has taken place on this very narrow strip, 1/4 of the Earth's surface. This very narrow equatorial region, more or less, has given birth to the civilizations during this phase. And as I said, he divides this, he sees world history as a single sort of gigantic breathing process. He calls it a breathing process in which he sees 2 breaths. The first breath is the one that we've already taken, which is unfolded in what he calls, and what he says is parallel streams amongst the different humanities, amongst the different civilizations. They've all been taking this breath in parallel streams. And the first phase was the Promethean age, which is the age in which language and tool making and fire was domesticated, tools were made, language evolved, and all of that took place. This is the Promethean age. Then this was followed by the Mythical age, with the birth of high civilization in the Near East, in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Then that comes in and cycles through and exhausts itself by the time we get to his famous Axial age, 800 BC. Then we have the Axial age, in which humanity's spiritual foundations, in the Heideggerian sense of the fundamental grounds of the human spirit, are worked out during the Axial period. Then the Axial period gives way to the modern Heideggerian framing, the Gestell, the period of the scientific technological understanding of being, which Jaspers says is really the first truly new thing that humanity has invented since the great religions of the Axial age, religions which are still constitutive of a great degree of world history. We're still inhabiting the shells and husks of the great world religions of Buddhism and Hinduism and Islam and Christianity that came out of the Axial world age, so we're still within it in that sense. And then he says that but that's the first breathing process. And the second breathing process, the first breathing process took place in multiple streams, whereas he sees that the second process will now be taken as a single breath by humanity as a whole. It will be global in extent. And that the scientific and technological age is actually a new Promethean age. It's a new beginning, a re-beginning of the cycle of history that will probably be followed by something analogous to the rebuilding of a new civilization that's analogous to the Mythical age when high civilization was built, which will then be followed by a second Axial age in which a new spiritual humanism will have to be reworked as a, I suppose, as a counterculture to this technological period of enframing. And that will then be followed by whatever the final stage happens to be. But he sees this unfolding in the future as a single global destiny. And he says so that what he means then in the book's title by the origin and goal of history is that the origin of history is the creation of one mankind. That's the origin of history. And the goal of history, the omega point, which he's blurry about, he doesn't specify it, but he says that it is the one, as he calls it, the one world of mankind on the earth, the single breath that will be taken, that will move history on into its next phase, that will be taken by humanity as a whole, because we can no longer have, whereas in the first breath, everything was unfolded in a local sense. Everything was local. Egypt, China, India, everything unfolded locally. The possibility for something to happen in a local sense is gone now, since humanity is globally interconnected, and so it all will happen in a non-local global sense that will unfold in the centuries to come. And I think part of the problem with this model, though, is that, and it's a problem that's typical of models of this sort that were written prior to the 60s awareness of the environmental movement that was triggered off by the publication of Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring. I think that was 1960, which note takes place just after the Russians launch Sputnik into orbit in 1957, which circumnavigates the Earth. and for the first time, as McLuhan was fond of pointing out, placed the Earth inside of a mechanical environment, and suddenly environmentalism becomes a new sort of all-inclusive field of awareness that surrounds us. So environmentalism was a byproduct of Sputnik. This was one of McLuhan's great insights. But all of this comes after Jaspers in 1949 here, and these kinds of theoreticians, Toynbee and Spengler, and maybe only Spengler had a clue about this, is that Jaspers' model sort of presupposes that things as they are now, this global age that is interconnected by technology, will continue indefinitely into the future, as though the assumption is that there's this unlimited amount of resources and energy that can continue to sustain this kind of global civilization indefinitely. And now, since the environmental period of the 60s, and now with the awareness of the devastating effects of these technologies, these industrial technologies upon the biosphere, now with global warming and greenhouse gases and the melting of the polar ice caps and the rising of sea levels, I think we can begin to see that this isn't something that's going to be a permanent development of humanity that's going to last indefinitely into the future. We've passed peak oil already. America passed peak oil in the 1970s. The globe is now perhaps at this point reaching peak oil. In a century and a half at the very most, all the fossil fuels are going to be gone, and the fossil fuels have made all of this possible. The civilization that we're in is a civilization, is the great fossil fuel civilization par excellence. And when those fuels run out, there really isn't anything that's going to be able to replace it. There are no other cheap, efficient energy sources that can be used to build civilization of this magnitude. Everything depends on these fuels, and they're going to be gone. And not only that, but we have to deal with the consequences of the fossil fuel civilization in terms of its entropic natural byproduct, which is, of course, now the rising of the sea levels as the result of the outgassing of the CO2. As well as other greenhouse gases. CO2 isn't the only one, of course. Methane, chlorofluorocarbons, and nitrous oxide, and so forth. There are a lot of different greenhouse gases, but CO2 is the primary one and is the main thing that is outgassed by the burning of these fossil fuels, whether we're talking about coal or oil. And they've created a kind of cosmic heat dome around the Earth that is melting the polar ice caps, and the sea levels are rising, and they're not going to stop. They're going to keep rising. It's thermodynamically irreversible. And with the rise of these sea levels, note then that rewinding back to Jaspers' picture of the origination of civilization on this narrow equatorial band, it's precisely that narrow equatorial band that global warming as a single planetary catastrophe is going to render uninhabitable. That will turn into a gigantic desert, precisely the region that gave rise to civilization over the past 10,000 years or so, is going to be the region now rendered uninhabitable. It's going to be too hot to inhabit that region. We're going to see the Sahara Desert spread north into Europe. We're going to see the desertification of the Midwest. The deserts of the Southwest will spread into the Midwest in the United States. And we're going to see this band that gave birth to high civilization, this great Promethean mythical phase of civilization, will become uninhabitable. And so civilization will have to shift north into the Arctic Rim regions, which is going to be the only place left on the Earth where a habitable, viable civilization can be built. And so it's going to shift into a kind of an Arctic Rim civilization. Now, William Irwin Thompson had suggested in one of his essays called Pacific Shift that he saw civilization shifting along the Pacific Rim with California and Australia and Japan as the new central basin, the new kind of Mediterranean centered upon electronics. But what I think is going to happen is an Arctic Rim civilization, not a Pacific Rim civilization, in which Scandinavia, Russia, Siberia, Canada are going, Greenland eventually once the ice melts, are going to be the coveted real estate. Those are going to be warmer places. They won't be as cold as they are now. They'll be warmer places and they'll be coveted, and we should start to see a shift of these populations north into that region to form an Arctic Rim civilization, which may be a civilization of a very diminished kind compared to what we've seen in the past. So I think that Jaspers' model has problems here for taking into account this infinite globalization. It's not something, it is definitely something that has limits to its growth, I think. Now, Jaspers' model is a fourfold model. He's got 4 distinct phases, and it's a cyclical model because he sees it starting over again. So it's like one giant wheel that spins. Right now it has come to its end, and it's getting ready to start the second roll. That's one fourfold model, and it's a species of the fourfold model in Hesiod. We get the fourfold model that has been spinning endlessly, according to Hesiod, the age of the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age, that keeps restarting again. And Augustus, Virgil wrote about the restart of the Golden Age after the Iron Age in one of his eclogues, in which he saw under the reign of Augustus the beginnings of the Golden Age, which, interestingly enough, corresponded to the advent of Christianity with the birth of the Christ child, and he alludes to the birth of a Savior in his fourth eclogue. And this model is a cyclical model, an ever-recurring cyclical model, like the Hindu model of the yugas, in which there are four great yugas that comprise together a Mahayuga, the Mahayuga of the Krita, Trita, Dvapara, and Kali yugas that has been cycling endlessly, world without end throughout history. This is to be held in contrast to the single shot model that was invented by the Zoroastrians, where you have a single 12,000-year arc, a parabolic arc, like Pynchon's gravity's rainbow, a single parabolic arc of history that is divided neatly into four distinct epochs of 3,000 years each, with the creation of man at the beginning, with the cosmic ox and the cosmic man, both of whom are slain by Angra Mainyu, the great god of darkness. The second epoch coming to its end with the advent on stage of Zoroaster himself, who teaches the way of salvation. He's one of the great axial prophets who teaches the way of self-salvation through aligning oneself with the good, the ethically right, the good. And then the end of history with an apocalypse that happens in Zoroastrianism. And all of this is seen to be an absolute beginning and an absolute ending, something that isn't going to restart, but it is four phases. This should be contrasted with the model put forth by Joachim of Florus in the 12th century, which was a three-phase model. And three-phase models basically are rest upon Trinitarian ideas, Christian Trinitarian ideas. For Joachim of Florus, the idea was that the Old Testament was the first age of history, the age of the Father, and his covenant with the Jewish people as a single people, which was followed by the New Testament, the age of the Church, the age of the Son, and the dissemination and democratization of the covenant to all people so that everyone on the planet could be available to this covenant, could have access to it. And then what Joachim saw as the advent of a third age would be the age of the Holy Ghost, which he saw beginning in the year 1260 or thereabouts, with the monk as the central figure. I think he was thinking of St. Francis as the exemplar, the central figure who will replace the wandering monk, who will replace the priest. And the monastery will replace the church will fall away. It's almost like a foreshadowing of the coming of Protestantism, in which the church and the priest are no longer trusted, and one has to rely upon one's own direct experience with the divine. That's a sort of recasting of the old axial age myth, in which the great national religions and their priesthood are no longer trustworthy and reliable, and one instead has to go to the local guru and find out what sort of model for spiritual salvation he has in mind for you, and follow that model. And it will fish the soul out of the waters of ignorance and darkness and materiality. That's Joachim's model, and that became the basis for Dante's model in the Divine Comedy of Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, again a three-phase model. Lessing in the 18th century adapted that in his short essay on the education of the human race, in which he saw the evolution of history unfolding through the childhood of man, the maturity of man, and the old age of man. And then Joyce, coming along, writing his unfinished, alas, great trilogy, Ulysses, Finnegan's Wake, and the Unwritten Sea epic that he had planned to write, was deliberately trying to update Joachim's model via Dante, with Ulysses corresponding to the Inferno, Finnegan's Wake corresponding to the Purgatorio, and the Unwritten Sea epic corresponding to the Paradiso. And Joyce also, who was familiar with Indian mysticism and had studied the Upanishads, was also trying to weld together the microcosm with the macrocosm. In the Upanishads, we have a threefold model that transpires on a daily basis, where consciousness awakens. You have waking consciousness, which would have corresponded to Ulysses in one direction, and the Inferno in the other, waking consciousness, the hell of the ego stuck in waking consciousness. Dreaming consciousness, which would have corresponded to Finnegan's Wake, man's great book of the night, the dream world, Vishnu's sleep, dream, and world history, which would have corresponded to the Purgatorio, and the Unwritten Sea epic as the Paradiso, which would have corresponded to deep dreamless sleep, the dark paradisal realm that consciousness exists in which there is no subject-object distinction. And so Joyce was trying to weld those two together, microcosm and macrocosm together, in a single vision. And so Jaspers' model is a fourfold model, so it's both cyclical, although it's one turn of the cycle, and